from conference. I'm also the co-author of a forthcoming book called Team Topologies, which I'll explain in a bit. Did you all enjoy the lunch? Good. It's the best mashed potato I've had ever. So there's 4 parts of this talk, 30 minutes. I'll try to squeeze it into slightly less than 30 minutes, so there's time for questions at the end. So to start with, we'll look at the Spotify model, what it means. We'll look at then some limitations in that model. Before a very, very brief introduction to Team Topologies. And finally, a few ideas, suggestions for getting started with this kind of approach to building and organising your teams and organisations for effective software delivery. So here's a Spotify model. Here's another Spotify model. We're not talking about either of those kinds of Spotify models today. I'm sure they're very nice people, but the Spotify model we're talking about is the Spotify, the model that Spotify put together to describe how they do software delivery. And it looks like this. This is from a blog post, or it's actually a PDF, a blog post that Henry Kleberg and Anders Ivarsson in 2012 published.
Who has not seen this diagram before? 1, 2, maybe about a third or half of the room. Okay, so if you search online for the Spotify model, you'll end up finding a page that includes this diagram. You may have heard of some of the terms from this post, though. And what they talked about is, so Spotify is a music streaming service. I should have said that before. With many users listening to music all the time. Lots of interesting stuff around artists' rights management and payments and so on. Anyhow, they needed to move very, very quickly, and so going back to the early, sort of about almost 10 years ago now, Spotify described how they'd organise their teams. And in Spotify terminology, they have a squad, which is a group of people with different sets of skills who are focused on one slice of the business domain, one particular set of features or one workflow. A collection of squads they called a tribe. So a tribe is like a family of related squads that work on very similar things or a similar part of the domain. And they also talked about a chapter, which is a group of individuals in the same tribe with the same kind of skills. So let's say testers in the payments tribe or developers in the artist management tribe. And they also talked about a guild, which is a looser grouping of people who are interested in a particular thing. Maybe it's people interested in test automation or people interested in internationalization, something like this. And many, so that's just explaining what I've just said. Many organizations have found this model really useful. And you'll hear organizations saying, oh, we're going to adopt the Spotify model. Many of these organizations believe that that is going to solve all of their software delivery problems. And in case you've not guessed, this talk is kind of explains a little bit about why that's not the case. However, I want to just first look at how the Spotify model does help. What's interesting about it? Because we'll look at some interesting dynamics about software delivery in modern organizations and the kind of things we need to think about. So the first thing that the Spotify model encouraged at Spotify in terms of how they implemented it was it encourages the flow of change. And this certainly is true for organizations who have kind of adopted this sort of model. Who was not in the keynote by Sam Newman this morning? Who didn't manage to get to that? So everyone here saw one or two. So I'd really recommend going to have a look at the video when the video comes out. Everyone else, you'll be familiar with some of this. So the cross-functional teams that Sam was talking about that are aligned to a particular segment of the domain, that's effectively what Spotify are doing here. They don't talk about it exactly in those terms, but that's what Spotify did. And just like Sam said this morning, that kind of helps to encourage a flow of change, because you've got a team that's responsible for the kind of end-to-end feature delivery, and all the capabilities that that team needs are inside that squad. And the flow of change is good, because if we get to the point where we're focusing as an organization on flow, that brings many organizational business level benefits. The second thing that I think the Spotify model does is to kind of clarify the team responsibilities, because we've got these different names for different things, and we have sliced the domain problem into segments that align to teams. It's easier for us to say this team, if you like, owns this part of the domain problem. In many organisations that we hear about, and so it is my experience consulting, is many of the software delivery problems relate to ambiguity in who owns what. So clarifying who owns what, who's responsible for what, can really help to make software delivery more effective. And it also promotes the right kind of collaboration between teams. Because we have tribes, which are groups of squads that relate together, actually at Spotify, the squads inside a single tribe will sit in the same part of the building. So they are much more likely to communicate together. And that's fine, because those teams should talk to each other, because they're working on that part of the domain. Teams in other tribes will sit further away. And that's also a good thing, because there should be less need for them to communicate with these teams over here, working on a different part of the problem. If there is a need for them to communicate a lot, that's a signal that we've got the boundaries wrong somehow. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. And the fourth thing I think the Spotify model does is to help plan for and budget for things that really help within the organisation that cross teams. So if you remember the guild, which is the kind of purple dotted line in the diagram, that brings people together from lots of different areas of the organisation, but it can also help us to plan for things like internal tech conferences, where we bring everyone together and have a session a bit like we're having today, but just inside the organisation. Or it might be lunchtime tech talks, or other kind of ways of bringing people together. Because the Spotify model explicitly gets people to think about the relationships between teams, then one of the outcomes should be that we're now explicitly planning to enable cross-team collaboration, communication, and this kind of thing, rather than just assuming that that's going to happen. So all these things are good. These are all great. And the Spotify model has helped some organizations to achieve these things. But there are some limitations. And I want to just share those with you briefly now. And the first limitation is actually in the original blog post from 2012. Kniberg and Evarson say this in the blog post. They say, this article is only a snapshot of our current way of working, a journey in progress, not a journey completed. By the time you read this, things have already changed. So someone comes along, reads the blog post, misses this part, they ignore this part because they don't really read it or whatever. They look at the nice diagram and go, right, we'll implement the Spotify model, that will solve all our problems. And they don't read this bit. By the time Spotify published the post, Spotify's model had already changed. A talk by Marcin Florian, who is an engineer at Spotify in 2016 at QCon, was entitled, "There is no Spotify model." So Spotify themselves are going to public conferences and saying there is no Spotify model. Perhaps we should listen to them. Perhaps we should listen to what they're saying. I want to share with you now 4 things. I mean, I think there are more than 4 things, but I want to share with you just 4 today. 4 things that I think are important to consider in the context of software delivery in the modern world. 4 things that are missing from the Spotify model that are really important. And these 4 things that I'll share with you today, I'll explain a little bit later in the talk how I think we can address them. The first thing that I think is missing is considerations around the size of software that teams have to deal with. and particularly cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of mental effort required to work on something that in our context is software. It could be another kind of information, knowledge work situation. But for example, if as a software developer I have to remember some crazy command to work out how to deploy a package or to spin up this kind of new environment, that's extra cognitive load that is preventing me from better dealing with the more interesting, the more important kind of business problem domain. The Spotify model itself, in terms of the blog post, doesn't really give any pointers around Conway's law. Conway's law, we heard this morning in Sam Newman's talk. So there's this mirroring relationship whereby the communication paths in the organization have a very strong influence on the kind of software architecture that we're going to build. And so Spotify don't really talk about that very much, but it's an incredibly important thing that we need to address. So if you only go for Spotify, if you only look at what Spotify did and create squads and tribes and guilds and the rest of it, you won't be dealing with this. You'll be highly constrained in the kind of software you can build, which is clearly not good from a strategic point of view. The Spotify model also doesn't explicitly talk about the kind of interactions there are between teams. It talks about the shapes of the teams and where they sit and who's responsible, but it doesn't say very much about the nature of the interactions. And if we believe the systems thinker Russell Ackoff and people like that, then the most important thing about when you think about a system, like an organization, is the interactions of the parts, not the parts themselves. And the fourth thing I think is missing from the Spotify model is ways in which we can detect that our current organization design or team structure is not working. So we need to listen for triggers that should tell us how we need to evolve our team structure. So we know that Spotify have already evolved their team structure, right? They said that in the original blog post. They know that they need to evolve. They're listening for signals to help them evolve their team structure, but they don't explicitly say that in their post. So these are the four things we definitely need to address. There's a whole load more that we need to address as well, but in terms of the talk today, these are four things that I'd like you to take away that we definitely need to address when thinking about how we're doing software delivery at an interesting scale. And that's where Team Topologies comes in. I should first of all explain the word topology. So we can think of it as this: the way in which constituent parts are interrelated or arranged. It comes from the Greek word topologia. Topos means place in Greek, so how things are placed. So we've been doing research for roughly the last 5 years for various organizations, consulting work for organizations in China, EU, India, US, various places. We've done quite a bit of research into the academic research, peer-reviewed journal articles and things. There's been a really interesting increase in the work in that space over the last few years, including work to try and validate Conway's law, or to explore Conway's law within organizations and within organizations that are building things. And we've got some great case studies from some well-known organizations as well. The origins of the book actually came out of these DevOps topologies diagrams that I came up with back in 2013, and with my colleague Manuel, who's at the front here, we kind of evolved over a few years. And these have been really useful for quite a large number of different organizations, helping them to think about how they arrange their teams. For example, Philip Fisher-Ogden, who's Director of Engineering at Netflix, sent this tweet recently, saying, "Thanks for your insightful articulations of DevOps topologies. They inspired many discussions and helped us to think about what model Netflix teams could be using." So it was good for Netflix. And also Condé Nast, so Crystal Hirschhorn, who's Director of Engineering at Condé Nast, a big publishing company, also found the DevOps topologies useful, and is actually already publicising our new book for us before it's come out, which is great. The book cover looks like this, and it'll be published in September, and you can pre-order it now from Amazon. That's all great. Anyhow, I want to go through 4 things which address some of the gaps in the Spotify model now. 4 things that we've written about in the Team Topologies book that we think help to address some of these gaps. So the first one is this software size and cognitive load that we talked about before. And one of the ways in which we think you can address, or some companies are starting to address this problem of team cognitive load, is by what we've called team first thinking. And there's a few parts to this. The first is that the team is the means of delivery. The team is how we deliver things. It's not a collection of individuals. So we see a team effectively as an indivisible unit. We don't break it up. We don't reach inside the team to individuals. We see the team as the unit of how we kind of assemble our delivery system. We explicitly make sure that when we're designing the software systems, we take the cognitive load of the team into account. What do we mean by that? So that a team has got a maximum size. There's various reasons for this, but in the software context, the maximum size of a team is about 8 people. In some high trust organizations, you might be able to get away with a team of about up to 15 people, but generally speaking, much beyond 15, the dynamics change. So whether you're lower trust or high trust, there's still a limit on the cognitive load of that team, and therefore there's a limit on the size of a system that one team can properly understand and own, and therefore there's a limit on the size of components or microservices or subsystems that we should be building. So that has massive implications for software architecture, because if we start with the awareness that there is a maximum limit on the cognitive load that a team can deal with, there's logically also a maximum limit for the size of bits of stuff in our software architecture. And if you think about it, if you think about organizations that have difficulty supporting their systems and making them work well, often that's because the team that is given the task of supporting them can't really understand what's going on. And that's incredibly ineffective for organizations, because then you get outages, you get all sorts of problems. Code ownership, code quality goes down because the team who's been assigned to it doesn't really feel that they're able to evolve it, and so on. Sam Newman talked about this a little bit this morning in his talk. Choosing team boundaries, and therefore choosing software architecture boundaries, is a skill. It's not something that can be done arbitrarily. It's certainly not something that should be done by a manager with no technical awareness. Designing team boundaries and designing who has responsibility for different things is a software architecture problem because of this Conway's law mirroring relationship. So investing in skills and capabilities, things like DDD, in these kind of design techniques for understanding where the boundary should lie is very, very important. And we also need to think about the workspace, whether you're all located in the same place or whether you're kind of fully remote. What does the workspace feel like? How does that help the team do their stuff? So one of the case studies in the book is from an organisation in the UK, and they completely changed their office layout so that each separate business stream was on a separate floor, and had all the people that they needed in that business stream. So they had ops people, technology people, HR, legal, accounting, marketing, all on the same floor. They could all talk to each other, and there was less need to talk to people from a different stream who are on different floors, because logically, from a business point of view, the stream was where the profit and loss was associated. They had everyone on the same floor. That they even went to the extent, basically, of changing their office layout to enable this kind of team first sort of software architecture. So Conway's law is this mirroring effect, like I said before. There's various things that we can use. If we look at our current team structures and kind of organization design, we might then be able to get a clue about the natural software, or the software that would naturally emerge from our current organization structure. which might be very different from what we're trying to achieve. So if we know we need to go for microservices because we want to deploy rapidly and evolve things quickly, if our organization is set up in a way which is 90 degrees away from that, it's going to be very hard for us to get to microservices, for example. There's something called reverse Conway or inverse Conway, which means that, and some organizations have used this very successfully, which means that we change the organization layout and structure and relationships in order to give us a better chance of achieving the software architecture that we know we need. The important thing about Conway's law, and this is the point to take home and bring to your CTO or CIO or the person who's at the head of your kind of department, is Conway's law acts as a constraint on the search space for solutions. This is a business level, organization level, strategic constraint on the kind of software we can build. So that if we're not thinking about how our organization, how the teams interact, we have accidentally constrained ourselves to building stuff which we might not want. Okay, so how do we go? I'll share with you an idea which we think is a little bit new. 3 well-defined ways in which teams interact. The first one is collaboration, but this is quite a specific thing. This is 2 teams working together for a defined period of time to discover something new. It's not having to work together with those grumpy people over there on a permanent basis. Because collaboration comes at a cost, if you like, because particularly if you're working with a team that has very different skills, then you're having to understand stuff which is not in your natural kind of awareness. So the cognitive load, again, is higher. But you're able to discover stuff very quickly. So if you need to have a new approach, a new technology, working together with another team with different skills can help you discover the right kind of APIs, the right kind of way in which to integrate things very quickly. But it needs to be very focused. It needs to be time-bound, and we need to be listening for the point at which it's time to change the interaction between the teams to something different. For example, this X as a service interaction, where one team provides something and one team consumes something. Now that might seem fairly normal, but what we need to do in this context is to make sure that the relationship is very, very good, so that the providing team really considers the experience of the consuming team in consuming whatever they're providing. So we think about what some people call developer experience, DevX. We think about how easy it is to, for example, install a component or to run a simulator of a service, something like this. And the team that's consuming things is ready to provide really high quality input back to the team that's providing things, so they can improve that interface over time. And the third interaction is a kind of facilitating interaction. So a team that is helping another team to improve its capabilities, improve its skills, and so on. As far as we can see, these are really the only 3 kinds of interactions that are really needed in organizations that are building modern software systems. And getting to the point where we've got this kind of level of clarity within teams, so that teams understand, how should I be interacting with another team? What kind of interaction should I have? And if we've got the wrong kind of interaction, that's a signal that the boundaries in the software are in the wrong place, for example. Or it's a signal that we have the wrong capability inside our team. So this kind of stuff allows us to then start listening to the quality of the interactions in the organization, and using that to inform kind of at a strategic level where we invest in and what kind of it helps with those kind of more strategic decisions about capabilities and platforms and investment and so on. So if we have 3 teams working on kind of business focused applications, let's say application teams. In our book we call them stream-aligned teams for various reasons. There's a flow of change going from left to right. We might have 2 of these application teams that are effectively consuming this bit at the bottom is a platform. I don't really mention very much about that today, but they're consuming something called a platform, and they're just consuming it as a service. They're just using that. That's all fine. There's a little team over here on the left in red that's working on a complicated subsystem. So they've got really high degree of special skills. Maybe they've got PhDs in mathematics or something like this, and they provide that component as a service to these two teams at the bottom. This yellow team at the bottom here is collaborating with the platform team on something like introducing Kubernetes, something like this. And they're collaborating with that team at this point, but they're expecting to stop that collaboration in about 4 months. Because continuing to collaborate shows an absence of clarity about where the API lies. And perhaps these top two teams here, they need to skill up. They need to upskill in big data or something like this. So there's a team of data specialists who are kind of facilitating their increase in awareness. So we've got different kind of interactions depending on what we're trying to achieve. And these kind of interactions will change over time explicitly because we're trying to achieve different things. It's not a once and for all permanent way of interacting. It's interactions in order to achieve something, and then we change how we interact. So not all teams in the organization look the same. There are different kinds of teams doing different kind of things. We're aiming to discover things, to discover good patterns for using software and so on. But then, once we've discovered that, we should be pushing that down into the platform for other teams to use. If there's any awkwardness in the interactions between teams, that's actually a signal that something else is wrong. Like we said before, the domain boundaries are wrong, or the capabilities are missing, or something like this. We can start to actually treat, instead of just seeing this as seeing this, there's a problem of kind of humans not getting on. We can start to see it as something that's then very useful from a strategic point of view in the organization. So I want to share with you one thing about getting started, seeing as we're slightly running out of time, which is this concept of a thinnest viable platform. So in the past, many organizations built great big platforms that were really huge and really difficult to use, and teams had to use them, but they were awful to use and really difficult and really slow and so on. We're not talking about that kind of platform. We're talking about something very different. Imagine if you're a startup and you're using, say, Amazon or Azure, whatever, and you only need to use 5 services. That's it, to make your product work. Your platform might be a wiki page which says, only use these 5 services. That's the extent of your platform. That's the thinnest platform you could possibly have, a wiki page with a list of services that you should be using in this organization right now. You don't need to build a huge thing. Obviously, in large organizations, the platform would be a little bit bigger than a wiki page, but might not be very much bigger. So consider to yourselves, what is the thinnest platform that could work in your context? And platform will come with documentation, will come with onboarding help, will come with code examples, will come with runnable examples, mocks, stubs, test harnesses, this kind of thing. With a focus on making the developer experience for your platform as good as possible. So seeing the Spotify model does help, but it's if you only follow what Spotify talked about in 2012, it'll be very limited. We also need to think about these kind of things here. So software sizing, cognitive load, the effect of Conway's law on your organization. It will be having effect. Conway's law will be having an effect on your organization, but what is it? We should really thinking about how teams interact. It's not just about shapes of teams and where they're placed and who's responsible. It's about how teams are interacting. That's where some of the magic lies. Then we need to be listening for signals that tell us we need to change how teams are interacting and composed. So that's these 4 things here. So there's the book again, teamtopologies.com/book. We'll get you there. We're actually doing some training tomorrow. I think it's full. Are there spaces left? It's full, isn't it? So we're doing day one fundamentals training tomorrow. Sorry, it's full. But if you're interested, then just get in touch. And we've got more dates coming up. And if you want to sign up for news and things when we've got blog and we've got Q&As coming up, podcast possibly, then sign up at teamtopologies.com and you'll get some information. So that's all I've got, I think. Oh, next, actually, the next speaker in this room is actually my co-author, Manuel Page. So he's there on the right. So he'll actually be speaking next. So thank you very much for your time.